Hey, Katelyn. Are you feeling better?
I'm feeling better. I'm feeling humbled by 2025 thus far between a flu and the norovirus.
Ooh.
It was pretty rough there.
Was this the sickest you've ever been in your life?
I wish.
Ooh.
But I did sadly think of you when I had the norovirus because I thought perhaps you had experienced something similar.
Oh, no. Are you referencing my really unfortunate airplane sickness on the way back from Mexico a few years ago?
Yeah, I heard about it. Do you want to share the highlights here?
Well, everyone in my party fell to this particular sickness one day at a time, and I thought I had gotten away without it. And then about an hour into the plane flight home,
oh my gosh,
I did not feel so good. And all I can say is that for the first time in my life, I was grateful for how small the airplane bathroom was because the toilet and the sink were so close together. You could utilize both at the same time.
I definitely experienced that with norovirus. So I feel like we're starting to maybe veer into sinful territory because we're starting to empathize with each other.
No.
I've heard this is bad.
We might have empathized. Or maybe we sympathized.
Yeah, I haven't parsed the difference yet. Maybe we'll get to that.
Yeah, same.
From Religion News Service, this is Saved by the City, a podcast from two Christian women empathizing, sympathizing, having compassion, aerobicizing, all over the place. I'm Katelyn Beaty.
And I'm Roxy Stone. Listeners, we were also trying to get your empathy, or maybe sympathy, as we know we're a few weeks delayed in resuming the podcast for season 9.
Yeah, I was hit by the aforementioned sicknesses and was in bed for several days. And also, I don't know if you've seen or heard anything about this, but there has been a lot in the news in the world as well over the last couple months.
I think January was basically a year long. We all felt that way, right?
It's the way that kids experience early birthdays as really big and long because of the whole proportion of their life. I think January is similar. It's like, well, 1 month down, this is all of 2025. It always drags like that.
It does. I mean, probably the weather has something to do with it. Everybody's austerity measures, like everybody's doing like dry January and budget January and exercise every day January.
You know, we delayed so long that we're about to enter the church's austerity season of Lent.
I know. Lent.
Actually, we're in it now.
We're in it now when this episode comes out. Yes.
Yes.
Which is always like a few days before my birthday. So thank you for that.
Well, you can do whatever you want on your birthday.
Well, before we come back around to our topic du jour, namely how empathy has gone from virtue to vice, let's give some context. Let's help set that up. And I think to do so, we need a recap of 2025 so far.
Yes, perhaps it's time to just remind listeners all the headlines. Actually, not all, clearly. No. This is just a snippet of the many, many headlines we have lived through just in the last couple months.
All right.
So let's give the people what they probably don't want, but maybe need.
Well, we'll say it fun and fast.
Yeah, let's get through it fast.
All right, here we go. On January 1st, a truck rammed into crowds of people in New Orleans, leaving 14 people dead and 35 injured. Heck of a way to start off the new year.
January was also all the wildfires in Southern California, destroyed thousands and thousands of acres and burned down about 1,000 structures. Also in early January, but before becoming president, Trump announced he wanted to take over Greenland and the Panama Canal.
He also mentioned that he wanted Canada to be the 51st state.
Yeah, my dad just told me that. I was like, what? I missed that one.
Oh. On January 19th, there was a temporary TikTok ban. It began and ended that day, which listeners, follow us on TikTok at Saved by the City.
Also that day, a ceasefire began between Israel and Hamas in Gaza after a brutal 18-month war. And then the next day...
Yes, the next day came the inauguration of Donald J. Trump as the 47th president. One of his first moves in office, as promised, was to pardon or commute January 6th offenders. He also signed a bunch of executive orders, including on gender, immigration, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, pausing refugee programs, and renouncing birthright citizenship.
Getting stuff done. He also created the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, led by this totally normal man named Elon Musk. Please don't hurt us, Elon. Aimed at cutting spending of the U.S. government.
The following day, on January 21st, Episcopal Bishop Marianne Budde challenged President Trump to have mercy during a sermon to his face in the National Cathedral. That day, President Trump also ordered the closure of all federal DEI offices, or offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
On January 22nd, the Trump administration rescinds the protection of immigrants in sensitive areas, such as churches. And then 2 days later, the State Department freezes nearly all foreign aid except military aid to Israel and Egypt. Then 5 days later, they take it back. And they're like, LOL, we'll continue giving foreign aid.
On January 28th, the United States Office of Personnel Management offers deferred resignation to 2 million federal government employees. And to round out January, an airplane and a helicopter crashed into each other above D.C., killing everyone on board. Trump says DEI is at least partly responsible for the crash.
But how?
I don't believe that there was a reason offered. Okay. Common sense. Actually, I think he cited common sense.
Yeah, common sense. February started out with a lot of tariffy stuff, you know?
They were on, they were off.
Tariffs on Mexico and Canada. They're paused after negotiations. The tariffs on China moved forward. Musk tweets on February 3rd that he spent that past weekend feeding U.S. aid into the wood chipper.
That's a direct quote.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. That was not my rhetorical flourish.
On the 4th, China said they were going to do retaliatory tariffs. And on February 9th, there was a Super Bowl. Trump was there. He also designated the day as Gulf of America Day.
Also on that day, Trump instructs the Treasury Secretary to stop minting new pennies. I support this decision.
Agree. On February 11th, Google Calendar confirms it has removed Black History Month, Pride Month, and other cultural events from its service, saying the holidays were not sustainable for Google's new business model, which is rolling back an emphasis on DEI.
On February 13th, the Senate confirms Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, and Texas gets the measles.
Scary.
Yeah.
February 14th, Valentine's Day. More on that another time.
Yes.
On February 28th, President Trump hosted President Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukraine in his office. There was a shouting match. It was very uncomfortable.
And then to round up, bringing us into March, something about coming in like a lion. I don't remember. Trump signs an executive order to make English the official language of the United States.
I didn't know that wasn't already.
Wow. What? This is a very diverse nation, Roxy.
I did think that we had an official language. I did think that was true.
I did as well.
Learn something new every day. So in these bizarro, upside down times when the person appointed to the FBI has publicly said how much he dislikes the FBI and a vaccine skeptic is leading our health system, maybe we should not be surprised that there's like a whole movement of Christians who've decided that empathy is bad, or at the least toxic, if not downright sinful.
Yeah, it's a little strange. I didn't see this coming, but there was a lot that we named just a few minutes ago that I also did not see coming. We offered the above timeline to you listeners because this movement of Christians and their acolytes intersect with some key moments in the timeline, as we will discuss shortly.
But first, a shout out to the organization that makes this all possible. Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
From politics to pop culture, RNS knows religion is always in the room.
Saved by the City is back for a new season, but we're not just on your favorite audio platforms anymore. Check us out at YouTube and watch the video version of the podcast complete with some bloopers.
Bloop.
Watch us record and see our interviews with guests at youtube.com/@SavedByTheCity.
So youtube.com/@SavedByTheCity.
That's right.
We also, of course, want to hear your feedback and ideas for who we should have onto the show and what we should talk about. Shoot us an email at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. We'd love to hear from you.
I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. This week on The State of Belief, a panel of experts discussing the administration's attack on faith communities and the ways we are fighting back.
In response to these attacks, many faith leaders spoke out. They said, hey, that's false and that's wrong. They should not be targeting sacred beliefs and practices.
The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Distributed by Religion News Service Podcasts and available on your favorite podcast app.
Okay, so empathy. It's bad now.
Yep.
Why is it bad?
Yeah.
What is this new anti-empathy movement we're going on and on about?
Well, we're certainly talking about a thread or a strain of conversation that I have seen on social media a lot in the last several months. It feels like that's the primary place that people are talking about this notion that empathy is actually unhelpful, destructive, manipulative, that it's toxic. Empathy is, I guess, ruining the world. So social media has definitely amped up the volume on this.
And two of the louder voices on social media have also written books about how bad empathy is, published in the last 6 months. First, Allie Beth Stuckey, a conservative podcast host, book author, frequent tweeter. She published Toxic Empathy, subtitled How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion, in October, a few weeks before the election.
And then just a couple weeks ago, on February 18th, Joe Rigney, who we'll get to who that is. You may not know the name, but boy, will you soon. Published his book, The Sin of Empathy. Subtitle is Compassion and Its Counterfeits. He is tied up with Doug Wilson at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and is on the faculty of their new St. Andrews College. So he's a Doug Wilson acolyte, which I feel like then it makes sense. But
yes.
Who is Doug Wilson? Let's remind listeners. He's been publishing books for the last 30 years. Seems like he's always saying controversial things and kind of stirring the pot, especially about gender roles in the church. But also he has a portion of one of his books that's an apology for slavery.
That's right.
Based on his interpretation of scripture. He's kind of a grandfather of the new Christian masculinity theobro guys who, intersect, of course, with populist conservative politics and Christian nationalist stuff.
I call them the beards.
Yeah, there's a lot of beards, which I feel like is out of style.
I'm
sure they really
one
care.
Of them has a beard, and they mostly wear flannel.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's not 2014, you guys. Being a snob.
So far as I can tell, the Rigney's antipathy toward empathy, I'm going to coin that phrase, it sort of began to take shape in a conversation with Doug Wilson on YouTube about 3 years ago. A lot of the metaphors and arguments that they make in that 3-year-old's interview sort of eventually wound up being in Rigney's book.
Did you watch the conversation?
Unfortunately, I'll try to offer a fair representation of
yes, we should do that.
And, maybe we can find points of agreement even along the way. So the big metaphor that Rigney and Wilson come back to, and then it's like Rigney's continued to use it, is this sort of idea that somebody's drowning in quicksand. And you, as the helper, can do one of two things. You can jump in and try to save them, but also probably then now you're both drowning in quicksand. Or you can throw a rope or reach out a hand, but you would keep yourself tethered to solid ground behind you. And then you could actually save this person without drowning yourself. Well, empathy is the former. You jump all in with someone suffering. Sympathy, you keep yourself tethered to what they would say is objective truth or Christ, your identity in Christ. And this enables you to be able to save the person without losing yourself. He sometimes uses this as sympathy is to suffer with, but keeping yourself objective, whereas empathy is suffering in, letting their emotions become the North Star.
Part of what I'm picking up is that having an empathetic emotional response to somebody it might be too strong, and it might untether you from objective truth or from the truth of Christ or something. Like, emotions themselves can be used to get you on board with something that's actually bad or destructive or sinful. And so you can have a certain kind of compassion, but it can't go too far. You can't start to like identify with the person in whatever they want empathy for. So
Right.
both Rigney and Allie Beth Stuckey say this, like, empathy is a distortion or a manipulation of compassion.
Yeah, compassion is the virtue given by God, and empathy is a distortion of that. And they use a bunch of examples. Stuckey goes to abortion. Abortion, people say it's compassionate for the woman, but what about for the baby? So says like empathy doesn't consider the moral side of the equation. And Rigney, comes back to like pastoral counseling, and if somebody comes in and says that they are same-sex attracted, like there's a lot of like give the truth in love, right? This comes up a lot. So
I think I've heard this before. So hating the sin, loving the sinner,
right,
is proper compassion. But if you demonstrate empathy, you're like loving the sin and the sinner.
And understanding why they would sin and excusing them for that sin, and thus then like engaging in the sin along with the person.
Some of this feels a little like, is this just semantics?
It does feel a little that way. There were moments where I was like, okay, yeah, I can see where, we can get to a point where therapeutic speak sort of takes over our whole lives, and everything is sort of parsed through that, and we are unable to like move forward in productive ways. And I'm saying this really vaguely because I don't fully have this as formed out as I want to. But I think there's good conversations to be had about how like you can just spin in circles sometimes in some of those spaces, or, like sometimes the worst of counseling can sort of just keep you always going back to your childhood traumas and not necessarily moving forward, right?
Or maybe I don't know if Stuckey and Rigney and their followers would say this, but I can imagine a scenario where what a friend or someone in your life needs is, along with compassion, they need to be held accountable, or they need to be like given a push toward taking some responsibility for their actions. I don't even have something specific in mind, but I can imagine.
Al Mohler did.
Oh.
In a podcast with Rigney, where he went ahead and sort of equalized like counseling somebody who's same-sex attracted to counseling somebody who wanted to rob a bank, and said you would not tell this person to go ahead and rob the bank because they feel better, or it would make them feel fulfilled.
That was not the example because I mean, my own 2 cents is that these two things are so fundamentally different. Like, what are we talking about? Like, anytime you're attracted to someone, it's like you want to rob a bank. Al's robbing his own banks left and right then. I don't know. With his wife. I don't know. The metaphor is strained, I admit. But like, do you remember the moment where it was this meme for a couple months where an interviewer asked the stars of Wicked if they knew that people were holding space for the lyrics of Defying Gravity?
I'll never forget it.
I thought that was a great like distillation of like, what are we talking about in some of like holding space? What? There's perhaps an imprecise thing to like just being up in our feels with each other all the time. So yeah, okay, I can get that. But it feels like what Rigney and Stuckey want to do is prevent people from having too much compassion. Like, too much compassion can make you go into bad territory. It can like take over. So you always have to be like tempering your compassion.
Yeah.
And I just don't know that I buy this binary of like compassion, emotion, but like keep tethered to the truth, which is your rational mind and objective truth. Like I kind of fundamentally don't think that's how we work, you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I kept hearing them come back to this, like, there's a structural hierarchy in the sympathy dynamic where the person's tethered to the tree, and that makes that person stronger and the savior, and that what our world right now doesn't want is that hierarchy. Like, they don't want the helper healer because it offers this hierarchy. But of course, like, Wilson and Rigney are big on hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
They would talk, for example, about like, what if you're in a pastoral situation and a woman comes in, of course, and alleges that she's been abused.
Mm-hmm.
And they get kind of a back and forth about like being able to stay objective enough to see whether or not she was telling the truth about being abused, or if she was like trying to take advantage of like the Me Too moment.
Yeah, a lot of people would say, including people in pastoral ministry, would probably say, if a woman comes to me or my office and says that she's being abused, I would immediately tell her to like remove herself from contact with her spouse and seek refuge, and like, let's create a plan for you to escape a situation of abuse. And Rigney and Wilson are saying, wait. Don't automatically believe people when they tell you that they're suffering. It's up to you to kind of scope out or suss out what's objective truth.
Mm-hmm.
I guess women be lying is their big takeaway.
Among other things.
Or women, their account of reality cannot be trusted in the way that we've come to believe it can be trusted.
Yeah, I definitely don't think they're on board with the believe women first.
No. Right, yes.
I mean, I didn't hear them say like, don't believe them, default disbelieve them, but it just sort of seemed like a make sure you try to poke a lot of holes in it kind of as like the stance, you know, and that you were like objective enough to know.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, what I've found interesting in the social media conversation, in the sort of different interviews and appearances that these folks have made, is how the sin of empathy continues to become the thing to blame for every bad thing that's happening in the world today, and that those bad things that are happening in the world today happen to align pretty closely with a number of things that the Republican Party and the Trump administration have said are bad.
Like, basically, they're working from the sense that progressives and DEI culture has gone way too far, and all of that has been wrapped up in progressives' emphasis on showing empathy to people who claim they are hurting or are marginalized or are oppressed in some way. Let's stop letting those people tell us to have these empathetic feelings when that's created all these problems, as Rigney and Stuckey and like the right see them.
Mm-hmm.
There would never be any issue of empathy from the right, right? Like, because the Republicans apparently, or the GOP, are more like tough on crime.
Right. The only thing that you're maybe seeing in terms of empathy from conservatives is when their natural Jesus-inspired compassion has been exploited for progressive causes.
So Allie Beth Stuckey tweeted first day of the year, January 1st, toxic empathy kills. It's not just misleading. It's not just manipulative. It is deadly. Toxic empathy compels a person to have disproportionate, blinding compassion for whom the media hoists up as the victim. The trans person, the illegal immigrant, the Islamic extremist then leverages emotion to advocate for horrific policy, self-ID, open borders, protection for grooming gangs, etc. When we choose feelings over truth, we make very stupid, very dangerous decisions. The feelings versus truth thing is like, that feels like such a crux of it. Like, you have to keep your feelings in check because they're going to mislead you. You have to instead root yourself in the truth. And I'm like, what if the truth is found in part by having a no holds barred, compassionate response to someone who is suffering. That's where Allie and I are different, perhaps.
It is. It's one of the ways that you two differentiate yourselves from each other.
Okay, so what do you make of this tweet from Allie, Beth?
Yeah, I mean, what I see is just kind of what I was getting at earlier, which is like empathy, toxic empathy, distorted empathy, empathy gone too far, has become like the boogeyman of these folks for everything. So it's like anything that they're against. So LGBTQ inclusion, especially transgender. So that continues to be a main talking point in this arena, which is, like, just because you feel like a woman doesn't mean that you are. And so you can't, their words, like mutilating your body to become one. Immigration, we are too empathetic and let too many people over the border. DEI for sure, because that like puts identity politics so high up, and whatever comes along with that, like intersectionality or critical race theory, like all of that, sins of toxic empathy. Even USAID, they talked a bit about how that's, all this humanitarian aid that America has given is really because of having too much empathy, putting other countries before ourselves. And that's a distortion of Christian compassion. Christians love to help people in need. And so this plays on that.
If you feel bad for people who are starving in other countries, you should direct that money toward the local church or a local ministry. This should not be fun. I mean, that's a different argument, like small government argument as well. But it seems like, yes, if it's channeled through a ministry of Christian compassion, then of course we can, show support for people who are suffering in other parts of the world. But it's gotten out of control because of USAID. It's like gotten too big and too excessive.
Yeah, and funds too many liberal left-winging ideas with this promise of helping abstract children. And they blame Christian deconstruction on it too. Too many people feel triggered at church. Pastors shouldn't just accept that.
So if someone's like, I found it difficult to sit in church because of bad things I've experienced in the church, the pastor's supposed to be like, suck it up.
They really like how on the podcast between Al Mohler and Joe Rigney, they kept coming back to J.D. Vance. They really like him. And they really liked how he said, I don't care, Margaret. And they used that several times. As sort of, I don't care.
Okay. Now that we have YouTube.
They threw a punch at Pope Francis, too, for over-preferencing the poor.
Like the traditional Catholic teaching that the church has a preferential option for the poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
DEI, run amok.
Yeah.
They also somehow manage to bring this all back to women.
Yes, absolutely.
So help me understand that.
I mean, I think it's best understood by listening to Al Mohler and Joe Rigney come around to the point in the last third of the interview, which aired, by the way, on February 25th. If you want to go check it out, where they land is that feminism is the true source of toxic, sinful empathy. Empathy has always been around in the world, they say, but it's so dangerous today because of feminism.
People have always thrown pity parties. That's always been a thing. Why is it so destructive in the modern world? It's feminism. Because what feminism has done is it's taken the more empathetic sex. Women are the more empathetic sex by God's design. I think it's a glorious design feature that God made women to intuit emotions, share emotions, feel emotions, respond to suffering people with care and compassion. This is a great and glorious gift that God intended to be used for his glory and the good of others. That's true. But that same gift, if you try to put it in other contexts, particularly contexts in which you have to draw clear lines and show fortitude and courage in the face of threats, it is not an asset. It is a liability. There is a reason that the empathetic sex, that women are barred from the pastoral office. They were barred from the priestly office in the Old Testament for the same reason, because priests in the Old Testament, pastors and ministers and elders in the New Testament, are charged fundamentally with guarding the doctrine and worship of the church, of setting the perimeter for what is in and out. That's the calling. And therefore, the sex that says, that is bent and wired towards care, nurture, compassion, and empathy is ill-suited to that role. So it's no surprise that in a culture which has become dominated by feminism, it's deep in the American system at this point, that in that same time frame, you would have an outbreak of empathy that would become the steering wheel by which every institution is hijacked.
And Rigney brought this up after Marion Buddy's sermon.
Yeah. He tweeted that women's ordination is a cancer that unleashes untethered empathy in the church and spills over into society.
I feel like our listeners probably have like a good sense of Rigney and Stuckey's arguments, like why empathy is a sin. But perhaps they want to hear what we think about it, even though we haven't been awesome about like hiding our thoughts, hiding our feelings about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to go back to this feeling that we're living in a bizarro world, it is very odd to me to see Christian leaders warning against, basically, I think what they're warning against is having too much compassion. Like whether you want to call it empathy, sympathy, compassion, it's basically you should not feel too badly for any particular person, no matter what they tell you. And it just feels like Christians of all people should be able and willing to be with other people in their pain and suffering, even if that means a risk of that person taking advantage of you or that person continuing on a path that you think is maybe destructive. Like, we don't get to control, at least in interpersonal ways, how someone receives our empathy, that it feels like that's really not up to us. Like our responsibility is to be with people in an incarnational way in the pain they're experiencing. That just feels like a basic Christian virtue to me.
Yes.
And so it's odd that we are not in consensus about that right now.
Yes. And I am not sure that I understand or buy this definition of how sympathy and empathy are different, or that that's a black and white difference. Like, I think that you can have empathy with someone whose choices you're not necessarily agreeing with and who you can offer biblical wisdom and counseling to, or advice to, or just, the advice based on experience that you might have. I think you can do both. I think you can say, I see you. I can understand how you're feeling that way. I know I felt that way before. And I can understand why you would want to do XYZ. However, once I did that and it didn't go so well for me. Or however, I wonder if you might consider this instead.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know that you have to forego the former in order to offer wisdom to someone.
Right.
Or hard-won truths. Like, in fact, I think people will hear from you better if you haven't been a jerk.
So you're saying if I'm like coming into a pastoral counseling session and I'm same-sex attracted and like concerned about that or seeking counsel on that or something, like convinced that it's wrong, and the person across from me says, well, I'm not going to tell you to rob a bank, am I? So nor am I going to tell you to identify with your sin, right? You're saying that might not go over well.
I think
Like,
not.
I might not be receptive to what you have to say without sensing that you actually have compassion or want to have compassion.
Yeah, I think not. And at the same time, I'm not saying that it should be a Trojan horse. Like, you should be nice to somebody so then you can clobber them over the head later. Listeners, please hear that from me.
Yeah.
They want to stay in power. Like, I think so many of these things have come from a sense of losing the place at the top of the hierarchy. Like, look, women got some power. Oh, look, like minorities got some power. And have a voice, you know? And my voice got silenced a little bit, or at least sidelined a little bit, or at least just kind of not handed the mic immediately. And
yeah, these guys definitely still have a voice.
yeah. And you know, this is why, because women took over. Like, you know, I mean, it just, so to me, that is another cynical reading of this from my perspective, is just this way of reasserting a particular way of thinking as the most objective, the most truthful, the most grounded in reality. And it just happens to be like the white male way of thinking.
What do we tell our listeners to do with their empathy? Let's get really prescriptive.
That's a good question. I have not been personally planning to change anything about the way that I display or feel empathy after hearing their arguments.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to the Marin Buddy sermon at the National Cathedral and the brouhaha over that. And this sense or perception that a lot of the things that she was articulating in that sermon were like weak or soft. Like a weak or soft vision of what Christianity is. And I think it highlights that we have, at the very least, like two different accounts of what Christianity is right now. Definitely more, but if you could crystallize it and simplify it, it would be like the America first, this is a Christian country, fight for your, I don't know, white Christian heritage. And really, we have to seize power and use it against our political enemies in order to guarantee like our future and the future of the country.
For the good of everyone.
Yeah. Versus a more, I would say, like a kind of Christianity that is more centered on the person of Christ and looking at the person of Christ as an example of how we are to treat other people in our midst. And I obviously, again, this is simplified, and I'm not saying that the latter doesn't have its own problems or its own weaknesses, but I do think that Christians might have to be willing to look a little weak or soft in their display of empathy as a kind of counterexample to the Christian nationalist version of Christianity.
I think that's really right. I'm reminded of something Russell Moore has said quite a few times, that he has heard from pastors who've said that when they've like literally preached the Sermon on the Mount, that parishioners have written emails and called them to say like that was too progressive or too liberal. And that's what it makes me think of, is that it's like, what person of Christ are you suggesting that we model? Because you keep coming back to like our identity is in Christ, but these are the literal words of Christ. And so like, what words of Christ are you suggesting we model, if not those? And where are you finding this sort of tough love, truth at all costs, even if it hurts, like in this way, in this hierarchical way? Like, where is that in the life and words of Christ?
They would probably say, well, Jesus didn't mince words about sin. You know, Jesus like was harsh towards some people. But I'm like, yeah, but Jesus also compared himself to a mother hen. And Jesus preached the parable of the Good Samaritan, which, if that's not toxic empathy, I don't know what is. Like,
I know.
Went above and beyond.
Put himself in danger and spent too much money that he didn't have, maybe, on this hurt person.
So at the very least, it's like, well, your love the sinner, hate the sin thing, like, you can't extrapolate that neatly from scripture or from the person of Christ.
No, I don't think so. Not without like only focusing on the turning over of the tables in the temple or something.
Yeah, Jesus made a whip, Roxy, Mark Driscoll's favorite passage.
It so is.
Well, perhaps I should have empathy for Joe Rigney and Allie Beth Stuckey to round this out. I don't know what that looks like.
I was going to ask.
you know, maybe they have undealt with anger in their life. That's the therapy speak.
It is. Could you just tweet at them who hurt you?
Yeah, exactly. Who should I be holding space for? Whose lyrics? Which lyrics should I be holding space for? Have you seen Wicked?
Yes.
Would you recommend?
You haven't seen it yet?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I've seen it twice. I would recommend it.
Okay.
It drags in a couple moments.
And it's only part 1.
I know, but at the end, it's so good at the end that you forget all about all that.
The defying gravity bit.
Yeah, it's. I have indeed held a lot of space for that in my head since it's good.
What if women are actually more empathetic, but it's precisely women in leadership that God wants to make the world a more empathetic place? Hot take.
It sounds like a slippery slope, Caitlin, to the end of the
quicksand.
World. Yes.
It doesn't come up in life as much as we thought it would.
Right? Like The Princess Bride, Never-Ending Story. Oh my God.
Oh. That's where everything went south.
Honestly, that is when I started feeling empathy for a horse.
See, these days, these crazy days, people want us to feel empathy for a horse. And I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stay grounded in objective truth.
Yeah.
Don't let a horse manipulate you.
Saved by the City is a religion news service production. The producer is Jay Woodward and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell. We get production assistance from Julia Wyndham.
Chaz Rousseau put together our look and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
We are Roxy Stone
and Caitlin Beaty.
Thanks for listening.